July 9, 1944, 28,000 feet above Ploesti, Romania. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Doolittle III of the 8th Air Force's 401st Bombardment Group banked his P-51D Mustang through wisps of high-altitude clouds, scanning the horizon for enemy aircraft. The young pilot knew his fuel gauge would be hovering near empty by now, or at least it should have been. Instead, he had enough to escort the bombers all the way home and even linger a bit longer if needed. The brass back at base would be furious with what he'd done to his perfectly tuned Packard V-1650 Merlin engine, but Doolittle knew something most of his superiors didn't. Sometimes to win a war, you had to break the rules. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how American airmen deliberately ruined their engines, extending their operational range, and changing the air war over Europe through unauthorized modifications that would ultimately help win the war. Colonel Harrison Thing of the 356th Fighter Group had been flying combat missions since early 1943. At 37, he was older than most pilots under his command and infinitely more experienced. The colonel had flown in the Pacific before being transferred to the European theater, giving him a unique perspective on aerial combat tactics. On this particular morning, he stood before a room of 30 fighter pilots at Martlesham Heath Airfield in Suffolk, England, clipboard in hand, his weathered face stern as he delivered the day's mission brief. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we're escorting the heavies to Ploesti again. The bombers will hit the oil refineries while we keep the Luftwaffe off their backs. As you know, this is deep penetration into enemy territory," Thing said, pointing to a large map of Europe where a red string marked their intended flight path. "Fuel conservation is critical. Maximum lean mixture settings once we cross the channel. No unauthorized departures from formation. No hot dogging." The colonel's eyes settled briefly on Lieutenant Michael Sullivan, whose eager smile faded under the commanding officer's gaze. Sullivan had earned a reputation for aggressive flying, often breaking formation to chase enemy fighters at the cost of precious fuel. "Remember, gentlemen, a P-51 that runs out of gas is just an expensive glider. And Romania is a terrible place to practice gliding," Thing added, drawing nervous laughter from the assembled pilots. What Colonel Thing didn't know was that 4 of his pilots, Sullivan included, had been secretly experimenting with their engine settings for weeks. The official maintenance protocols for the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, built under license by Packard in America, were treated like gospel. The technical manuals specified precise fuel-to-air mixture settings that maintenance crews rigorously enforced. These settings prioritized engine longevity and performance, not maximum range. Lieutenant Sullivan had first gotten the idea after a conversation with a bomber crew chief from the 91st Bombardment Group. The B-17 crews had been stretching their fuel for months through aggressive leaning techniques that technical manuals explicitly warned against. By reducing the fuel flow well beyond recommended settings, they found they could stretch their operational range by as much as 15–20%, the difference between making it back to friendly territory or ditching in the North Sea. "The book says it'll damage the engines over time," Sullivan explained to his fellow pilots in the privacy of their quarters that evening. "But who cares about overtime if you're dead today because you ran out of fuel over Germany?" Technical Sergeant Walter Kowalski, a Polish-American mechanic assigned to the 356th Fighter Group, was initially horrified by what the pilots were proposing. A 29-year-old from Detroit who had worked at automotive plants before the war, Kowalski had an almost religious devotion to proper maintenance protocols. "You can't just lean the mixture that much," Kowalski had protested when Sullivan first approached him. "You'll burn the valves. You'll increase cylinder head temperatures beyond tolerances. The supercharger will." Sullivan cut him off. "We know the risks, Walt. But we're losing pilots every week who run out of fuel trying to make it home. If we can stretch our range by even 15%, that could save lives." Kowalski reluctantly agreed to help them modify the fuel mixture controls on their aircraft, but only after hours, away from the watchful eyes of the maintenance squadron commander. As a precaution, they would only modify 4 aircraft initially, Sullivan's, plus those belonging to Lieutenants James Parker, Robert Miller, and David Cohen. The Packard 1650 Merlin engine that powered the P-51 Mustang was a mechanical marvel, producing over 1,500 horsepower when pushed to its limits. Its supercharger allowed it to maintain power at high altitudes where the air was thin, giving American fighters the ability to escort bombers all the way to targets deep in enemy territory. However, this performance came at a cost: fuel consumption. At maximum power, the Merlin gulped 120 gallons per hour, emptying the Mustang's internal tanks in less than 2 hours. With external drop tanks, range improved considerably, but pilots still operated on razor-thin fuel margins for distant targets. The modification that Sullivan and Kowalski implemented was elegant in its simplicity. The Merlin's fuel mixture control had a mechanical stop that prevented pilots from leaning the mixture beyond what engineers deemed safe. By filing down this stop and recalibrating the mixture control, they enabled pilots to reduce fuel flow by an additional 30% during cruise flight. This would theoretically increase range by up to 25%, though at the risk of engine damage if used improperly. When Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, visited Martlesham Heath in early June 1944, he brought disturbing news. Intelligence reports indicated that the Luftwaffe was deliberately targeting fuel-starved American fighters on their return journeys. German pilots had learned that by simply staying out of reach and following the Americans as they headed home, they could pick off stragglers whose fuel gauges approached empty. "We're losing almost as many planes to fuel exhaustion as we are to enemy action," Kepner told the assembled squadron commanders. "The Krauts know exactly how far our fighters can go, and they're using it against us." Colonel Thing thought of his 4 pilots, who always seemed to return with more fuel than the others. Initially, he had attributed it to superior piloting skills and disciplined throttle management. But the discrepancy was becoming too consistent to ignore. After the general's briefing, Thing cornered Sullivan in the officer's mess. "Lieutenant, I couldn't help but notice that you and your 3 wingmen consistently return with more fuel than the rest of the squadron. Care to explain?" Sullivan hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. "Sir, we've modified our fuel mixture controls. We can lean the engines about 30% more than the manual allows. It's giving us almost an hour of additional flight time." Thing's expression darkened. "You've been tampering with Army Air Force property? Do you know how many regulations that violates?" "Yes, sir. But it works. And it's keeping us alive." What happened next would change the air war over Europe. Rather than disciplining the pilots, Colonel Thing asked for a demonstration. The next morning, he accompanied Sullivan and Sergeant Kowalski to a Mustang parked in the hardstand area. Kowalski showed him the modified mixture control and explained the technique for using it safely. "The trick is to lean gradually and watch the cylinder head temperature gauge," Kowalski explained. "You push it right to the edge of running too hot, but not over. In practice, we've found you can cruise at just 38 gallons per hour instead of the standard 60, and still maintain sufficient power for formation flight." "And the engines?" Thing asked. "How badly are they being damaged?" "That's the surprising part, sir," Sullivan interjected. "We've been logging the engine performance after each mission. So far, we've seen no significant decrease in performance. The engines are running rougher, and they'll probably need overhaul sooner, but we're talking about maybe 250 flight hours instead of 400. Thing nodded thoughtfully. "And in return, we get significantly more range." "Yes, sir. We estimate about 25% more." The implications were immediately clear to Thing. With 25% greater range, his fighter group could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory, spend more time protecting them over the target, and still have sufficient fuel reserves for combat and the return journey. The strategic impact would be enormous. Captain Werner Mulders of the Luftwaffe's JG-53 fighter wing had been flying against American fighters for over a year. From his perspective, the Americans' fuel limitations were their greatest weakness. In his squadron briefing room at an airfield near Frankfurt, he explained the situation to his pilots using a map of Europe with concentric circles drawn from various Allied air bases in England. "The Americans have a fuel problem," Mulders explained to his pilots. "Their P-47s can only escort the bombers this far," he said, pointing to a circle that encompassed parts of Western Germany. "Their P-51s can go deeper, to about here. His finger traced another circle that reached into central Germany. This means that if we engage them here, he continued, pointing to areas near the edge of the P-51's range, we force them to burn fuel in combat. Many will not make it home. Our tactics should focus on drawing them into extended engagements when they are far from their bases. What Mulders and the Luftwaffe didn't realize was that the rules of the game were about to change. In the weeks after Colonel Thing's discovery of Sullivan's modifications, the technique spread rapidly throughout the 8th Air Force's fighter groups. Initially, it was shared unofficially, pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. Maintenance crews would make the modifications under cover of darkness, away from the eyes of inspection teams and by-the-book officers. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force and father of Lieutenant James Doolittle III, was known for his willingness to buck convention when necessary. When reports of the modified mixture controls reached his desk in July 1944, along with data showing the dramatic increase in operational range, he made a momentous decision. Instead of punishing the rule breakers, he issued a directive that officially sanctioned the modification across all fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. The directive was carefully worded to avoid admitting that they were deliberately sacrificing engine longevity. In light of operational requirements and the critical need for extended fighter escort capability, all P-51 aircraft will be modified to allow for enhanced mixture control settings. Maintenance intervals will be adjusted accordingly. This bureaucratic language masked a revolutionary change in how the air war would be fought. Virtually overnight, American fighters gained an additional 100 to 150 miles of operational radius, a game-changing advantage that the Luftwaffe was completely unprepared for. The impact was immediate and devastating. German fighter commanders who had carefully calculated intercept points based on known American fuel limitations suddenly found themselves facing Mustangs that stayed in the fight far longer than should have been possible. Bomber formations that previously would have been vulnerable for portions of their routes now had continuous fighter escort from takeoff to landing. Oberst Karl Bohm-Tettelbach, commander of JG-27, wrote in his report to Luftwaffe High Command on August 10, 1944, "The American fighters are now accompanying the bomber formations all the way to targets as distant as Prague and Vienna. Our previous tactics of waiting for fuel-starved fighters to depart are no longer effective. The P-51s remain over the target area for extended periods, still capable of maximum performance combat maneuvers. This represents a significant strategic change in the air war." The statistics told the story clearly. In May 1944, before the widespread adoption of the modified mixture controls, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 3.2 fighters per mission to fuel exhaustion. By September, that number had dropped to 0.3, a reduction of more than 90%. More importantly, bomber losses to enemy fighters decreased by 38% as American escorts were able to provide continuous protection throughout the mission profile. For the ground crews, however, the new directive created significant challenges. Technical Sergeant Thomas Reynolds of the 4th Fighter Group at Debden Air Base had been a mechanic for Rolls-Royce before the war. He understood the Merlin engine's design limitations intimately and recognized the long-term implications of the modified mixture settings. "We're trading engine life for operational range," Reynolds explained to his maintenance team. "These engines are going to come back with burned valves, cylinder scoring, and supercharger damage. Our overhaul schedule is going to accelerate dramatically. Indeed, the average time between engine overhauls dropped from 400 hours to approximately 240 hours by late 1944. This created an enormous logistics challenge, as the maintenance depots in England struggled to keep pace with the increased demand for engine rebuilds. The solution came from an unexpected source. Packard Motor Car Company, which manufactured the Merlin engines under license in Detroit, had been producing approximately 100 engines per day by mid-1944. When the company learned of the modified operational procedures being used in the field, their engineering team quickly developed a new set of cylinder head and valve seat specifications designed to withstand the higher temperatures associated with ultra-lean mixture settings. Henry Ford II, who had taken control of Ford Motor Company after his father's retirement, learned of Packard's efforts and offered Ford's massive production facilities to help address the engine overhaul backlog. By October 1944, a joint Ford-Packard operation was producing not only new engines, but also enhanced durability, cylinder head assemblies that could be quickly installed during field maintenance to extend engine life even under the new operational conditions. The production numbers were staggering. In November 1944 alone, American factories delivered 1,345 new Merlin engines to England, while maintenance depots rehabilitated another 893 engines with the enhanced components. This remarkable industrial output of 2,238 total operational engines in a single month demonstrated America's manufacturing prowess in vivid terms. By comparison, Germany's entire production of Daimler-Benz DB 605 engines, the power plant for their primary fighter, the Bf 109, totaled only 1,713 for the entire last quarter of 1944. Captain Richard Miller, an engineering officer with the 78th Fighter Group, maintained detailed records of engine performance under the new operational protocols. His data showed that while engines operated with the modified mixture settings did indeed suffer accelerated wear, the pattern was predictable and manageable. Cylinder head temperatures ran approximately 35 degrees Celsius hotter than recommended, but remained below the absolute maximum tolerances. Valve seat erosion accelerated, but followed a linear progression that maintenance crews could track and address before catastrophic failure. What we discovered, Miller wrote in his post-war analysis, was that the Merlin had more margin built into its design than even Rolls-Royce realized. The engine was overbuilt in many ways, which allowed us to push it harder than its creators intended. The maintenance crews developed innovative solutions to manage the increased wear. Technical Sergeant Paul Whitman of the 352nd Fighter Group created a simplified field test for valve seat condition using compressed air and a modified pressure gauge. This allowed mechanics to quickly identify engines approaching failure points without complete disassembly. We called it the Whitman whistle, recalled Corporal James Finch, who served under Whitman. If the gauge showed more than 15% leakage, we knew that engine needed new valve seats at the next service interval. Less than that, and it was good for another mission or two. The logistics of handling increased engine maintenance created new challenges. Major William Schmidt, logistics officer for 8 Fighter Command, implemented a rotational system whereby each fighter group maintained a 15% reserve of replacement engines. These reserves were cycled through a network of field maintenance units and centralized depots, ensuring that no squadron ever found itself grounded due to engine failures. The operational impact was immediately apparent in the mission statistics. Before the mixture modifications, the standard planning figure for P-51 combat radius was approximately 650 miles with drop tanks. By late 1944, the same aircraft were routinely conducting operations at ranges up to 850 miles, an increase that put virtually all of Nazi Germany within reach of Allied fighter escorts. Flight Lieutenant Peter Matthews, an RAF pilot attached to the 4th Fighter Group as an observer, wrote in his official report, "The Americans have effectively rewritten the capabilities of the Merlin engine. They are operating these power plants in ways that our RAF engineers would consider mechanical homicide, yet they're making it work through sheer industrial might. When an engine shows signs of excessive wear, they simply replace it, a luxury our more limited resources do not permit." The Germans, meanwhile, faced a different sort of challenge. The Luftwaffe had carefully developed tactics based on known American capabilities, including fighter range limitations. Now those tactics were obsolete. Furthermore, German industry, already strained by round-the-clock bombing and critical resource shortages, couldn't match the Americans' ability to simply accept higher engine replacement rates as a cost of doing business. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille, a Luftwaffe ace with 158 confirmed victories, expressed his frustration in a letter home dated September 12, 1944. "The Americans now seem to have unlimited range. We wait for them to turn back, but they remain. Even when we manage to damage their aircraft, they have sufficient fuel reserves to return to England. Meanwhile, our own fuel situation grows more desperate by the day. We are limited to 30 minutes of combat time, while they can stay for hours. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. The Luftwaffe had long relied on its ability to choose when and where to engage American formations, often waiting until the escort fighters were forced to turn back before attacking the bombers. Now, that advantage was gone. American fighters were present throughout the entire mission profile and often appeared in places where the Germans believed they couldn't possibly have sufficient fuel to operate. In October 1944, Lieutenant Cohen, one of the original 4 pilots who had pioneered the modification, was shot down over northern Germany. He survived the crash landing and was captured. During his interrogation, the German intelligence officer expressed disbelief when Cohen mentioned the duration of his mission. "Impossible," the officer said. AP-51 cannot fly for such a distance. Our intelligence is very precise on American aircraft capabilities. Cohen simply smiled. "You might want to update your intelligence." The story of how American pilots ruined their engines to gain extended range illustrates a fundamental difference in how the opposing sides approached the air war. The Americans, with their massive industrial capacity, could afford to trade engine longevity for operational range. If an engine needed to be replaced after 250 hours instead of 400, so be it. The factories back home would simply produce more engines. The Germans, constrained by bombing, resource limitations, and a collapsing economy, couldn't afford such luxuries. Every engine had to last as long as possible. Every aircraft was precious. The different approaches reflected not just technical decisions, but the fundamental strategic realities of the war by 1944. The story also highlights the American talent for practical innovation. The mixture control modification wasn't a sophisticated technological breakthrough. It was a simple mechanical adjustment that traded one performance parameter for another. But its impact on the strategic air campaign was profound. By extending fighter escort range, it helped secure air superiority over Europe, protected the bomber streams that were systematically destroying German industrial capacity, and ultimately contributed significantly to the Allied victory. After the war, many of the pilots who had pioneered these modifications went on to successful careers in commercial aviation and the aerospace industry. Lieutenant Sullivan became a test pilot for North American Aviation, later working on the F-86 Sabre jet fighter program. Sergeant Kowalski was hired by Pratt & Whitney, where his practical experience with engine modifications proved invaluable in developing the next generation of aircraft engines. The lessons learned from these wartime experiences influenced commercial aviation as well. The techniques for maximizing range through precise mixture control became standard practice for long-distance flights, albeit with more sophisticated instrumentation and without deliberately sacrificing engine longevity. Colonel Thing, who had the foresight to recognize the value of his pilots' unauthorized experiments, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership and tactical innovations. In his memoir, published in 1978, he wrote, "Sometimes winning a war requires breaking the rules." The young pilots who modified their engines understood something that many senior officers didn't. In combat, the primary goal is to complete the mission and return home. Everything else, including equipment longevity, is secondary. The modified mixture control settings were eventually incorporated into official technical manuals and training programs. What began as a prohibited modification became standard operating procedure, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout military history as battlefield innovations made their way up the chain of command. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany from east and west, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. Fuel shortages, combined with overwhelming Allied air superiority, had reduced German air operations to a fraction of their former level. The American fighters that had once struggled to reach targets deep in enemy territory now operated with impunity across the entire European theater. The story of these engine modifications also reflected a uniquely American approach to warfare, one that emphasized practical problem-solving, individual initiative, and industrial might. The ability to absorb higher maintenance costs in exchange for operational advantages demonstrated the enormous material superiority that the United States brought to the conflict. This approach extended beyond just engine modifications. Throughout the air campaign, American forces consistently traded material consumption for operational advantages. When intelligence revealed that German fighters were targeting bombers that dropped out of formation due to minor damage, the 8th Air Force implemented a policy requiring all aircraft to remain in formation unless critically damaged. This increased the fuel consumption of damaged aircraft as they struggled to maintain position, but significantly reduced losses, another example of trading resource consumption for survival. Major General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the 3rd Air Division of the 8th Air Force before being transferred to the Pacific, was a strong advocate for such practical innovations. In this business, there's no prize for being the most efficient user of resources, he reportedly told his staff. The prize goes to whoever wins the damn war. The mixture control modifications represented exactly this philosophy in action. By sacrificing engine longevity, a resource the Americans had in abundance, they gained operational range, which translated directly to reduced losses and increased combat effectiveness. Not everyone supported the modifications, however. Colonel James Henderson, a senior engineering officer at Wright Field in Ohio, wrote a scathing memo in September 1944 condemning the practice. These field modifications represent a dangerous departure from established engineering standards. The long-term damage to these precision engines will create cascading maintenance issues that may not become apparent until critical moments. We are setting a dangerous precedent by allowing field expedients to override laboratory-tested specifications. Henderson's concerns were taken seriously enough that a formal study was commissioned, with engineers from both Rolls-Royce and Packard participating. Their findings, delivered in November 1944, effectively vindicated the field modifications. The report concluded, while operation at ultra-lean mixture settings does indeed accelerate certain wear patterns, particularly in the valve train and cylinder heads, the progression of this wear is predictable and manageable within the established maintenance framework. The operational benefits, in terms of extended range and reduced loss rates, outweigh the engineering concerns. What the report didn't explicitly state, but what everyone understood, was that by November 1944, the strategic situation had evolved to a point where the Allies could afford to prioritize operational effectiveness over equipment longevity. With American factories producing aircraft and engines at rates the Axis powers couldn't hope to match, trading engine life for combat effectiveness was a winning strategy. The human element of this story extended beyond just the pilots and mechanics. Workers at Packard's Detroit facility, when informed about how their engines were being used in combat, voluntarily implemented additional quality control checks that weren't called for in the manufacturing procedures. The mixture control modification program also revealed interesting cultural differences between American and British approaches to aircraft operation. The RAF, which also flew Merlin-powered fighters including the Spitfire, was initially reluctant to adopt the American modifications. Wing Commander Ian Gleed of the RAF's 244 Wing explained the British perspective in a memo to 8th Air Force Headquarters. While we appreciate the operational advantages demonstrated by your extended range operations, our maintenance philosophy emphasizes equipment longevity and reliability over maximum performance. Our more constrained replacement pipeline cannot absorb the increased engine failure rates your approach would entail. By early 1945, however, as Packard's production of the enhanced durability components increased, even the RAF began to adopt modified mixture settings for certain long-range operations. The cultural difference never entirely disappeared. American pilots generally operated their engines more aggressively than their British counterparts, but the gap narrowed as the overwhelming advantages became apparent. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Army Air Force conducted a comprehensive analysis of the modified mixture control program. The report, classified until 1972, concluded, the willingness to accept reduced engine life in exchange for extended range provided a critical advantage in the air campaign over Europe. The estimated 25% increase in operational radius enabled continuous fighter escort throughout the bomber mission profile, significantly reducing losses and increasing the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. The additional maintenance burden was more than offset by the operational benefits. Perhaps most tellingly, When Rolls-Royce engineers examined captured German aircraft engines after the war, they discovered that the Luftwaffe had been experimenting with similar modifications to extend the range of their own fighters. But they had started too late and lacked the industrial capacity to manage the increased maintenance requirements that came with such modifications. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Doolittle III, whose father had authorized the widespread adoption of the modified mixture controls, summed it up best in a 1985 interview. "We weren't really ruining our engines. We were using them differently than the engineers intended." The book said one thing, but combat experience taught us another. Sometimes you have to trust the men in the cockpit over the men in the laboratory. The story of how American pilots modified their engines to gain additional range remains a powerful example of how innovation, often from the bottom up, can change the course of a conflict. It reminds us that victory in war depends not just on technology and resources, but on the adaptability, initiative, and courage of those who use them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.